Yeah, so I'm writing at the moment on the historical novel Before Scott. So usually what people are told is that the historical novel begins with Scott, and that really only before Scott we only have historical fiction, which is a much more juvenile kind of form, somehow artistically incomplete. And what I'm doing is looking at these books and treating them as historical novels, which I'll talk a bit more about later in the paper, but also considering how they build or help to invent Britain. And sometimes they also interrogate Britain, because obviously it's a nation made up of different parts. It's a composite nation, and it requires quite a lot of ideological work to make, for example, the Scottish and the English happy with one another. And this is sometimes carried out through the historical novel. So I begin with this image by a guy called Robert Kerr Porter. And he was a history painter in the late 18th, early 19th century. And his sister was a historical novelist, Jane Porter, who wrote The Scottish Chiefs, which is one of the historical novels I edited. And he painted this picture in 1803, but it actually refers to events 10 years earlier, around the time of the French Revolution, and particularly around the time that the French Revolutionary Wars were beginning. And what he's showing here is the siege of Toulon. So these are all kind of French people in this picture, and this is a young Napoleon. In fact, he didn't take a very prevalent part in this battle, but as Porter is kind of fictionalizing it, there he is. And here are the distressed French people below. So his picture uses both classical reference and the language of feeling to dramatize the plight of the French people. The woman holding her baby with her arm up in appeal in the center of the picture here references the rape of the Sabine women. And the tragic lovers in the bottom left, there they are, belong to the vocabulary of the sentimental novel. And the painting really amounts to a kind of visual argument that the division that exists in French society is not, as it might be supposed, between the people and the king, but between the people and the revolution itself, so that the revolution is responsible for the suffering of the citizens of France. But this is an artificial story, because there is a missing term, the term of nation. Toulon had been delivered to the control of the British Navy on the 1st of October. But Porter has left out the Anglo-Spanish and the counter-revolutionary forces who are actually in charge of Toulon at this point. So by leaving out these foreign aggressors, Porter is able to imply that the revolution for liberty is itself responsible for suffering rather than a foreign invader. The revolution brought the political importance of the people to the fore. But during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, this idea of the importance of the people would be complicated and tested and exploited in the service of nation. Okay. And the gap, we see here there's a gap across the center of Porter's picture. So the gap perhaps between the people and their rulers, or the gap between the English and the French, or maybe it might represent a kind of breakage of the revolution, a kind of before and after. You know, why would we have this mysterious gap across the middle of the painting? And more fancifully, from my point of view, I'm saying it almost points to a generic absence, the absence of the discussion of history and historical change, and particularly the historical novel Before Scott. So what is the place of the historical novel in the narrative of nation? We can say it's an attempt to mobilize the almost spiritual or ecstatic feelings that are connected with nation, but also to interrogate these ecstatic feelings as well. And we see that though to identify with nation in that way is very complicated for the British, made up as they are of these different peoples. And then, of course, we also have the separate case of Ireland, which I'm not going to be addressing tonight, but if anybody wants to ask me in questions, I can talk about. Okay. So, in her late novel, Helen, 1834, Maria Edgeworth refers to Scott as the great and good enchanter. And Scott had also been an admirer of Edgeworth. In the general preface to the Waverley novels, he states that it was the extended and well-merited fame of Miss Edgeworth that had led him to recollect the unfinished manuscript that became Waverley, and Waverley often thought of as being the first historical novel. And Scott's remarks support a certain critical narrative, the assumption that there's a national tale and then a historical novel, that the historical novel in some sense only comes into being with Scott. And in this critical narrative, tales by Edgeworth or Sidney Owenson make particular use of history, of stadial history, history that happens in stages. And Scott takes this use and he transforms and develops it. But the picture appears very different when the historical novel before Scott is taken into account. Even before the publication of Waverley, historical fiction was engaging with the form of history writing in order to reimagine the nation. And the historical novel became a vehicle for such national reimagining because in the decades before Waverley, attempts to explain the French Revolution often relied on historical analogues, historical parallels, and they invoked history as the major interpretive framework for the events of the Revolution. So in the 1790s, the historical novel adopted a more probing approach to national identity by using and transforming the tropes of historiography. So I just want to briefly address that question, is there an historical novel before Walter Scott at all? And for a long time, I have to admit that the historical novel before Scott was a rather elusive genre. Individual books have received some critical attention, individual novels, particularly when they're influenced by the French. But the form was generally held to begin only with Scott, at least in the kind of Anglophone tradition. National tale scholarship, particularly Katie Trumpner's exploration, began to reveal a bardic tradition before Scott. And equally, Richard Maxwell and Anne H. Stevens posit earlier origins for historical fiction than 1814. But there are some very significant silences. Maxwell doesn't discuss the 18th century British historical novel. It's just a blank. Stevens concentrates on the publishing history of these fictions. It's a kind of quantitative approach. If you come across Franco Moretti's work, it's that kind of approach. In some ways, very, very good book, but that's the kind of approach he takes. And this kind of discomfort marks Lukács's continuing influence. So George Lukács famously positioned Scott as the first historical novelist because of the sense of change that Scott registers. But it's possible to extend Lukács's argument. Scott is the first historical novelist, not merely because his works are set in the past, but because he shapes historical discourse in a certain way. So it's this engagement with the idea of history that is crucial to the historical novel. It is the interrogation of the subject matter, methodology, the purpose, the manufacture, and the reception of history that constitutes the historical novel. And this interrogation is part of a struggle to imagine and code political change. And when this is understood, we can begin to reveal that there is an 18th century British historical novel of considerable complexity, and that it speaks to the issue of nation. In his Reflections on the Revolution in France, it may be a text that you've come across by Edmund Burke, Burke asserts his right to speculate on what has been done or is doing on the public stage in any place, ancient or modern, in the Republic of Rome or the Republic of Paris. And he shows the ease with which the educated 18th century mind can move between the classical and the contemporary, employing to argumentative purpose the comparative potential of history. But his exact wording is worth considering. He concentrates on the location and the type of government. He refers to capitals, to Paris and Rome, rather than to countries or nations. But this is a kind of synecdoche. Not only the model of social organisation, but the nature of the nation itself can be interrogated using history. And the complex use of history in Burke's Reflections points to the centrality of history in the French Revolution debate that follows. And so during the 1790s, the historical novel flourished. I mean, there was an explosion, really, in the number of historical novels that were written in the 1790s, as Anna Stevens says. And in this form, the journey from considering the mode of government to critiquing the nation and the people who formed the nation was short. So if you like, the distance between kind of political issues of representation, of individual liberty, compared to the issues of thinking of the group, of the nation, of the little platoon, there was a kind of swift move between the two. Okay, so that'll become clearer in a moment. So in his discourse on our love of our country, Richard Price explored the idea that people had the right to cashier kings, to get rid of or sack kings, an idea attacked by Burke in his Reflections, and an idea, of course, which had been put into practice in an American context, as this image of the statue of King George III being toppled in Bowling Green in 1776 suggests. So we'd really had an American precedent for this idea of getting rid of kings. Sorry. Now, the historical novel engages with this idea of the political power of the people. And in the 1790s, it begins to re-examine the relationship between the people and the monarch. So in a way, it forms a reflection on the events of the French Revolution, on the events of the American Revolution, and I suppose the thing that is very rarely mentioned, on the English Revolution that had happened in the 17th century. I mean, it's always a kind of great unspoken thing that we had this revolution ourselves. Okay. But in a British context, these issues are complicated by the composite nature of Great Britain, of the Union of Great Britain, and by the very complicated stories of succession that underpinned it. Okay. The early 1790s saw a spate of novels that returned to King Alfred, an early Anglo-Saxon king. He's associated with the growth of learning and with Christianity, and he's also seen as a very egalitarian figure in some senses. So he is seen as a kind of political ideal. He evokes the ancient constitution of Britain to justify the privileges of the people. But this narrative of ancient legal liberties would really, in some sense, only work for England, because Alfred was an Anglo-Saxon monarch. And in the early 1790s, several historical novelists began to tackle the history of the relationship between England and Scotland. So we have, for example, Monmouth, a tale founded on historic facts by Anna Maria Johnson, and also Henry Siddons's William Wallace. And these are attempts to assess the nature of liberty within the Union. Both asks what constitutes rebellion. Is it rebellion to reject a king that does not share a nation's religion, for example? So a king who's got Catholic sympathies, or their views of liberty? Should the people be condemned as treacherous if oaths have been taken on mistaken premises or under military force? Necessarily evoking or drawing directly upon the context of Scotland's struggle against England, such historical novels began to explore not only the rights of the people, the political rights, but the nature and the justification of the Union. But the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars impact on such concerns, and they create a demand for narratives of stronger patriotism and union and allegiance. And I'm going to talk very briefly too later in the paper about some examples of this, and this is where the Roman heritage comes into play, the claimed British Roman heritage, in Ellis Cornelia Knight's Marcus Flaminius, 1794, and the anonymous Arville Castle. So I want to start, though, with Monmouth. So now, Monmouth, as the name suggests, is a fictionalisation and to some extent an extenuation of the Monmouth Rebellion of 1685. So bear with me here. When James Scott, Duke of Monmouth and natural son of Charles II, attempted to seize the throne from King James II. Do you remember that King James is actually displaced from the throne in the Glorious Revolution a few years later? So, in fact, there is a kind of successful Glorious Revolution after this that is really praised throughout the British 18th century as being the ideal of revolution. It's not really a revolution, though. It's more of a military coup, to be honest. So this book then refers to an earlier unsuccessful attempt at revolution. Monmouth is participating in a rebellion, so he must be condemned to some extent. But on the other hand, the events of 1688 and 89 lend the sanction of history to the hero's attempt to displace James II. It's a little bit complicated, but anyway, we can see here, I include these pictures. So this is the famous image of Charles I on horseback compared to this image of James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, and leader of the Monmouth Rebellion. And you can see he's even more kind of heroic and dynamic in his military self-presentation than the rather less fortunate Charles I. Okay. And the novel suggests the role of the Scottish nobility in protecting liberty. The role, figured by the fortress that we are introduced to at the beginning of the novel, is nearly at an end. The castle is in a state of decay. So at the beginning of the novel, we're lulled into a kind of sense of security. You know, England and Scotland are perhaps presumably at peace because the castle has been allowed to decay. Time, the narrator insists, is the only enemy that enjoys success against the castle, and the period of invasion, civil strife and struggle is, the reader may suppose, over, and liberty is safe. But and then we have the owner of the castle, Donald Bruce. And Bruce spends his days in retirement, so he avoids kind of the slavish dependence upon the will of despotism of Charles I. And he also avoids the violence of indulged passions. So he charts a middle course. And this is pictured through the use of musical instruments. So he avoids the soft and enervating melody of the flute, but he also avoids the martial drum and trumpet. And instead, this primitive Scotsman was gratified by that kind of harmony which, to ears tuned to its rough and sonorous notes, gave the most ample satisfaction, the national and customary amusement of the bagpipe. And it now represents not Scottish aggression, but moderation and simplicity. Donald listens to it while eating his morning repast of eggs, milk and honey, and the piper's diurnal revolutions around his hall recall Edward Bruce's triumphs, or play and dirge to the memory of that unfortunate hero. Okay. But despite such musical set pieces, there is political trouble afoot. Retirement is again threatened by Stuart excesses. Arthur, Donald's son, tries to rein in the tendencies of the martyred King Charles I. When Charles decides to contend... where is it? Oh, that's the bagpipe. Beg your pardon. Charles decides to contend for that despotic form of government which, in the estimation of a proud and free people, took the appearance of tyranny and seemed to indicate an intention of acquiring an unbounded sway over the subjects who had not long been emancipated from papal authority, an arbitrary queen, and submission even to the stake, rather than forfeit their steady adherence to the Protestant faith. So what the narrator is suggesting here is that the royal family are less important, the displacement of the Stuarts is less important to the union between England and Scotland than religion. The fact that we have a shared religion is central to the narrative of the union. They have a shared cause, and they must move beyond dynastic politics to assure the liberty of a Britain. Okay. So Arthur then joins the Monmouth rebellion eventually because of the luxurious excesses of the Restoration. And the Taylor Rebellion, as they often do, also has a kind of allegory of sexual union. So Arthur leaves Margaret, his daughter, behind on the Isle of Skye. And there she encounters Monmouth and she falls in love with him. Okay. And Margaret is really something quite special. She cheerfully adopts the modes and habits congenial to the island, we're told, but there was taste in the make, disposition and colour of her simple attire. So she has that kind of rural adherence to tradition, but at the same time this elegant modernity. And as such, she could be the figure that would allow England and Scotland to move forward, were she to marry the right person. But she's in love with Monmouth, and Monmouth is a rebel. So how can this marriage be allowed to take place? There is also a historical obstacle because Monmouth is in fact married to somebody, was married to somebody else in, as it were, real life. So, I mean, the author can never have their way here. It's one of the difficulties with writing historical fiction, that some of these things did happen. So she cannot find a suitable mate. The union cannot be fully symbolised, therefore. And Monmouth is a far more barren novel than, say, The Wild Irish Girl. Monmouth, in proving to be already married, blocks the route to union, and he blocks the route to liberty at the same time. But the novel does suggest that the English and Scottish are joined in a common cause, which is British Protestant liberty. And if Monmouth tries to balance some of the elements within the Union to ensure a moderate political future, William Wallace, or the Highland Hero, a tale founded on historical facts, 1791, is far less sophisticated, but it's also a lot more provocative, and it's very negative, really, about the English. Written by young Henry Siddons, who's the son of the famous Sarah Siddons. Oh, I don't know what's... Oh, dear. Wait a moment. It's sort of not... What I can see there is not corresponding to what I have here. Anyway, sorry. Okay, so William Wallace, then, is written by a young Henry Siddons, and he's the son of the famous Sarah Siddons. I suppose William Wallace, you might have seen the movie Braveheart. Yes, okay, so that's William Wallace, a historical figure, yeah. Is seen as a very kind of radical figure in this novel. He's almost a bit like Alfred, but for the Scottish, because he is seen to focus on the people and on the idea of justice. In the scenes where the Scottish followers of Wallace combat King Edward I, a new focus emerges on the importance of the people. Wallace's countrymen have sworn allegiance to the king, but Wallace insists he is not a rebel fighting against Edward I. The narrative is quite explicit in suggesting that the people can reject the bond of fealty to their monarch, as happened in the American Revolution. Wallace, we are reminded, is the instigator of one of the greatest wonders in the pages of history, that a single man aided by a few straggling villagers should have made the King of England tremble. This is far from the discourse of inevitability suggested in Monmouth and sketched out more strongly in the later historical novel. The rough inhabitants of the Highlands, albeit unused to the melting mood, are portrayed as elevated by a kind of sentimental but dangerous heroism. Wallace's words act like fire on gunpowder. But the explosive militarism is also tempered by the urge to justice. In an incident very similar to that found in another novel about Alfred, the son of Ethelwood, Wallace is approached by the angry officer Alexander, and Alexander has been challenged by a subordinate, but because he's the superior officer, he thinks he should automatically triumph. Okay? But on inquiry, it emerges that the soldier, Douglas, has actually been protecting his wife against Alexander. If you're wondering why the wife is there on the battlefield, she's disguised herself as a young Highlander in order to accompany her husband. And there are a lot of cross-dressing incidents in these novels where women are sort of fired by female patriotism, and they usually dress up as a page or in some cases as a knight, and they go and fight. However, Alexander is very angry as the superior officer that he's been thwarted, and he dislikes Wallace's tone. He bridles under the investigation. "What then, will you encourage reptiles like this in mutiny?" he says to Wallace. "By no means," was the answer of our hero, "but at the same time, these reptiles, as you are pleased to term them, have an equal right to justice with yourself." So Douglas's actions are not mutiny, just as Wallace is not a rebel. And then Wallace is saved on the battlefield by a common Highland soldier whose countenance was horribly disfigured by blood. So we think that this terrible figure is going to attack Wallace, this representative, if you like, of the lower orders. But instead, he saves him, and then he turns out to be Douglas. So there's a message here that we shouldn't be afraid of the lower orders, that we should treat them with justice, and that therefore, our society will be more equitable, and the rulers will be more secure in one sense. Okay. And it's also worth noting that the narrative suggests that sexual relations will be disrupted till liberty is established. We must all put our desires on hold, or rather channel them into the nation, along with our kind of religious emotions as well, until we have achieved liberty. But the emphasis on liberty is clear enough to earn the disapproval of the critical review. And I don't know if I've got the critical... yes, okay. Yes. The critical review says, "Were even Mrs. Siddons to plead with all her former pathos and persuasive powers, she could not alter the degrees of criticism which condemn this novel as trifling, improbable, and absurd. The Highland chief contending with Edward is said to be fighting in the cause of liberty." So there's a very angry kind of English reviewer saying, well, how could William Wallace be a figure of liberty? I reject that idea. And he says the schoolboy should have been better employed and was to be severely reprehended for such idle engagements. Okay. So both of these novelists are driven by the French Revolution to reflect on British history, and both contain some more radical elements about how we could question our monarch and how we can think about political liberty for the people. But both are quite careful to avoid treasonous suggestions. So Monmouth's rebellion is justified by subsequent events, the Glorious Revolution. It doesn't threaten the Hanoverians. George III isn't going to be toppled. And meanwhile, Wallace, as he's positioned in the late 18th century narrative, never claims the throne and only fights on behalf of his true king and the nobility. But both novels discuss the issue of irresponsible or unjustified kingship. And then these muted treatments of the rights to cashier kings are complicated by the composite and uneasy nature of Britain. Wallace gives a highly unsympathetic portrait of Edward, for example, who calls Wallace a traitor. He forces him to fight with the English, and he places him under an English officer who had never failed during the war with Scotland to treat his prisoners with the utmost barbarity. The English are the baddies. The union is a difficult one, and attempts to justify it on moral grounds are doomed to failure, or at least very difficult. Okay, but nonetheless, the patriotic demands of the French Revolutionary War meant that the Union had to be given some better justification, even if only in the flexible space of historical fiction. And in William Wallace, the hero had addressed his troops, exhorting them to end oppression. History's page, he says, shall rank us with those Roman heroes who fought, who bled, who died for liberty. So the narrative of Roman liberty, seized from the French, who often use these images, would, as Burke's remarks also suggest, prove extremely useful to writers who wish to ensure British solidarity. Roman liberty could be assessed, the Roman presence in Britain could be discussed, and a vaguely defined group of Britons could be seen as the inheritors of true Roman values. The fact that obviously the Romans were only in part of Britain is irrelevant to these narratives. You know, we can all be seen as the British inheritors of Roman values. So this is in part what happens in Marcus Flaminius, written by Knight. And Knight wrote it in part to be a kind of armchair guide to Rome. And volume 2 has lengthy descriptions of monuments and of their republican meaning. But this is also an epistolary novel of sorts. Marcus doesn't really get any replies, but he does keep writing letters. The novel also begins in Germania, after the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, AD 10. This is seen to be a turning point in quote-unquote kind of European identity, with a sort of a peak in Roman expansionism, and this is seen to be a really significant defeat for them. So oddly, although it's supposed to be about Rome, lots of it is set in Germania. And Marcus, the hero, experiences the life of the Etruscans. And this way of life is in decline because of foreign corruption. And what we have here, so we think we're dealing with ancient Rome and Germania, but in fact we get a coded analysis of the causes of the French Revolution. It's really quite a bizarre novel. The causes of the French Revolution in this novel include philosophy, a false understanding of freedom, and a corrupt priesthood. And these factors lead to popular unrest amongst the Etruscan tribespeople. And in the second volume, Marcus encounters corruption in Rome, so the upper classes are also to blame for revolution. But this is also a study of empire and periphery, and a study in the correct mode of imperialism, which for Knight is underpinned by correct Roman values. The scenario that follows seems quite familiar from the National Tale, if anybody has read any National Tales. A reluctant wanderer, finding himself enduring an enforced stay in an apparently barbarous country, begins a process of cultural exploration and comparison. Marcus, Knight's hero, is a first-century Roman. But his depth of feeling mark him out as a kind of sentimental hero of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, a very romantic figure. Marcus, for instance, comments upon the vivacity of his imagination, a quality he shares with Owenson's hero Horatio in The Wild Irish Girl. And so Marcus's position in relation to the Etruscan women can be read as an approximate template for the National Tale. So in the National Tale, what happens is there's a union, a marriage between a man and a woman that, if you like, encourages or is seen to represent in some way the union of usually England and Ireland. So if we marry, everything will be fine, yes? So really, Knight's book is a little bit before those. It's written in 1794. But what we see is Marcus then being given the opportunity to choose his correct mate. And what Knight tells us is that Marcus, as a true Roman Republican, shouldn't marry the chieftain's daughter. He shouldn't marry this kind of primitive Turescan. And neither should he marry the sophisticated but corrupt Roman. So he has to, if you like, again, steer between these two extremes and choose the correct sexual partner. And his correct partner is the virtuous daughter of the Republican, Valerius. Her name's Valeria, so she's a very virtuous character. And then what happens is they don't have children, but instead they have guests. And the inheritors of their knowledge, the guests, are Britons. They're princes who come to explore Rome and its environs under the guidance of Marcus and Valerius and Valeria. And these Britons, Knight imagines, will form firm alliances and build an empire. And they will do this not through a marriage between the centre and the periphery, or between primitivism and sophistication, but through shared republican values. You know, and we also then have various points where Knight is discussing the great British Empire on the waves. The Britons will go forward, you know, with the usual Roman values that have been perpetuated through this relationship. Okay. So now I want to come on to Arville Castle. So this is really my personal favourite. It's probably not a very sophisticated novel, however. So if we look, certainly not if we look at what the reviewer says about it, this anonymous work, he says, invokes fancy, fiction and sensibility. And the critical review describes it as a wild, romantic story violating without scruple all the laws of nature and probability. Excellent. It's about forests and banditti, murders and apparitions, wandering damsels, faithful lovers. In short, a delectable and perfectly harmless entertainment to those who favour that sort of thing. Nonetheless, set in the 1st century against the backdrop of Boadicea's defence of Britain against the Romans and her subsequent suicide, this work initially examines resistance against imperialism. So at the start, as we might expect, the Romans are criticised. Imperialism is seen negatively. But it's not very long before this is reversed. The book makes a rather unexpected case for a union, a spiritually endorsed marriage between colonisers and colonised. So the colonising activity is really seen as quite a good thing. The family relations that are initially disrupted by the Romans have to be put back together in order to ensure the social order and to prevent revolution. So I should have a slide with some Druids on. Yes. So at first, rather reassuringly, the Romans display all the villainous characteristics expected of invaders. Suetonius is sanguinary, and the whole race of Druids are extirpated by the cruel Romans, and we're told their men either killed or made prisoners, left not hope for the wretched females of those days. So for women, rape or death seems the only alternative. Matrimony is impossible because of the death of the priestly caste. But the female-orientated society that is left regains a kind of symbolic fertility. As Ellen, one of the novel's heroines, finds after she dons male clothes, again the cross-dressing, neither Druids nor all the British men are dead. Not only can marriage still be celebrated, but the reader discovers that Raymond, Ellen's lover, is still alive. Matters take an unexpected turn. Raymond is saved by the virtuous Roman Julius, and he travels to Rome. And on his return from Rome, he constructs a rather strange breeding program, conciliating the differences between the Romans and the Britons, intermarrying the women with those under their command, and by other means endearing the families to each other. The family structures that have been severed by war are put back together on a national scale, and in fact on an international scale. Moreover, during this process, the Romans, with their prolific wives, become naturalised to Britain, displaying a power of generation linked with the fertility of the landscape itself. In this narrative, the colonised areas become superior to those that still resist Roman rule. No part of Britain was better cultivated or more populous. So you see in the historical novel, we've moved from an argument in favour of the liberty of the people and the interrogation of nation to a kind of historical novel that compares Britain to Rome, and it to some extent endorses imperialism as well as endorsing the Union. Yes, so the author of this book, still anonymously, still finds it rather difficult to imagine a unified ruling class, a ruling class that incorporates people from Rome, or England, and people from England, that is, other areas of the Union. It's a kind of allegory, I suppose. In Rome, Raymond himself refuses to marry Constantia. He refuses to marry a Roman. And Alice rejects the love of the virtuous Roman Julius, and it's an episode that I particularly like. She returns to partial sanity only after Ellen sings martial songs and plays the harp outside her door. And it's rather odd because Ellen, first of all, has to disguise herself as a page, and later on Julius says, oh, well, maybe Alice will be happier if you're a woman. So then Ellen kind of disguises herself in her own clothes. Yeah, it's very bizarre. If you have any questions on that afterwards, I shall explain further. But the problem is, Alice is mad. She can't really fully accept Roman rule, and she can't marry a Roman. And this kind of musical therapy is not working for her. But the barriers between the ruling classes of the centre and of the margin are overcome in the face of the threat of lower class criminality. So when a group of robbers are discovered in the middle of a wood, the two ruling classes finally unify in order to defeat the lower ranks. So here then, rebellion has become criminality, and the Romans and the Britons each have a ruling class that must unite to stamp it out. And afterwards, Julius is finally able to find the British bride he deserves, and reconciliation is complete. The ruling classes are back in charge, and the stage is set for empire. Thanks in part to Burke. Then, in conclusion, the issue of oppression and the nature of liberty raised by the French Revolution were dealt with through the lens of history. But in Britain, this was complicated by the composite nature of the Union. To examine liberty in the context of British history was to raise the issue of conflict between the countries involved. And in particular, since it was only in 1707 that England and Scotland had become one united kingdom by the name of Great Britain, in the early 1790s, the historical examination of liberty included an examination of England's relation with Scotland. So as a result, these historical novels highlighted, even while they attempted to disguise, the conflict involved. So they were superficially quite positive about union, but in fact, as they explored union, the kind of tensions became uncontrollable within these fictions. And to avoid such disturbance, later more conservative works examine liberty in the context of a more distant past, emphasising the existence of Britons and ignoring the existence of Picts, for example. And these Roman novels underline the supposedly beneficial nature of empire, and they look forward to the post-1800 creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. As such, they're perhaps rather politically uncomfortable. But it is worth noting that even these novels cast their narratives in terms that require some respect for the sister kingdoms. They emphasise shared values, a common commitment to liberty, and to the rule of law. So what we can see then in terms of the early historical novel, not only was there such a phenomenon as the early historical novel, we can also see that it predated the national tale, that it used some of the motifs of the national tale, and that although it proved a rather elusive form, if we study it, we fill an important gap in the discussion of the invention of the nation.
So, are there any questions for Fiona? I have a question.
Yes.
So, I kept thinking of Thomas Gray's poem, The Bard. I mean, it's earlier than the period that you were talking about, but there is a lot of Welsh nationalism, and it's kind of in microcosm a version of what's happening in the historical fiction. And I wanted to ask you if there were any bardic figures in these historical novels. You talked about the woman with the harp. She seemed like...
and in fact, I did give a paper on this, but I don't know if I'll be able to recall it all. There are a few little... I think there are a few strands there. There's the issue of Wales, which of course comes up in Gray's The Bard. Wales is often... It's not represented as often, I don't think. I haven't come across so many representations of Wales as of Ireland or Scotland, but sometimes it is positioned as a kind of home of loyalty, because obviously we were colonised a bit earlier, as it were. So that's one important use. And then we do have lots of kind of quasi-bardic figures. So, yes, the harpist who plays the martial song, and yet the martial song is supposed to heal by reminding the conquered people of the reality of their situation, I suppose, in some sense. So, but also sometimes the bardic is seen as a kind of stabilizing force, I suppose, or something that's necessary before union can take place. And I think Ed Larracy, in his book on blindness, talks about this, the idea of the bardic as a kind of vanishing mediator, where modernity will follow the disappearance of the bard or druid, but they're necessary, but they have to die.
There's a sad fate of the bards in the poem. Is there any other question?
Thank you so much. So the bard figure, if I'm clear, is playing the harp and the martial music to heal a woman of madness, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So thinking of Coleridge and how madness can sometimes be a visionary affliction rather than just, a disease, or sometimes it can kind of demonstrate sight into a spiritual reality or a future world that other people can't see. So is that kind of a difference of genre, maybe poetry and novel, or how does, madness function in these novels?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there probably is a difference. I don't always think it's viewed like that positively, or certainly as that kind of spiritual state, but it is seen as a rejection of a kind of crueler norm, So it's almost it does have an element of idealism or retreat, madness, in these novels. So another example would be Eleanor in Sophia Lee's The Recess. Goes mad, kind of having been confronted with the sort of tyrannies of Elizabeth I's reign, and Alice similarly unable to accept the trauma of Roman rule and the displacement and murder of some of her family. So it's seen as a reaction to historical trauma, I think, rather than necessarily spiritual. But I think the nation is a concept into which a lot of spiritual feeling goes. And I'm at the Huntington looking at Jane Porter's letters, and she definitely, is a case of this. So she's interested in these kind of great heroes, like somebody like William Wallace, who she makes into this powerful Christian figure, kind of warrior for the nation, and she calls herself a female patriot, and she says, would that I, even if it were for a few weeks, could go and be like that. And she also talks about Nelson, about Sidney Smith. So it is this, there's almost, especially from 1800 to 1810, this kind of searching for the national hero, who's also like a kind of Christian warrior. So the nation is definitely kind of Christianized, and it becomes very fervent, almost like evangelical. Cheers. Are you going to ask a question?
Great.
They don't let me get away with anything,
I was thinking about Conrad's Heart of Darkness in 1899, thinking about just in the terms of the tropes you set up about the novel becoming imperial through this reflection on Rome, and then I was thinking of Conrad's the reflections in the start of the novel about this on Romans colonizing us.
Yeah.
This is also one of the dark places. The kind of way in which that myth kind of returns, or I don't know. I was wondering if you had anything to say about this kind of like transformation or return to the kind of primal scene of Rome again at that point, sort of closure of that sequence.
Yes, I think I don't know if I fully brought it out, but so some of these novelists, they draw upon stadial history, which the stadial history of the Scottish Enlightenment, and that sees history in terms of particular stages. So the primitive stage versus I suppose it's usually seen as being a kind of pastoral stage, and then a commercial stage. And sometimes society progresses forward to the commercial stage, and sometimes it sort of declines. So that there is this tendency to sort of see, particularly in Marcus Flaminius, say the Germans as the kind of primitives, and the Romans as the sophisticates, and each has its kind of perils, and it's the finding a path between those two. But in Conrad, this was one of the dark places too, and then that idea of empire. There is, I don't know, is there any happy medium ever proposed? I don't think there ever is a solid happy medium, some kind of solution that is proposed. There's only that kind of the heart of darkness, or which is not only the colonial heart but also the heart of man, isn't it, in some sense? So I suppose typically in the movement towards modernism, there's an absence of certainty, isn't there? Whereas like in these novels are trying to sort of definitely map out how it is that we should behave to build a better nation.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, from what you're saying, because I was just thinking of the novel in light of what you're saying, Heart of Darkness, that is, there's commerce is condemned in terms of, Marlowe saying, I ventured to hint the company was run for profit. Commerce is the main motivator. And then in the scenes where he's talking about Britain, he imagines a young Roman legionnaire being posted to Britain, kind of going up there, ill and like
the horror of it,
And I guess the only, and you never know with Marlowe with the irony where he says the only thing that saves it is efficiency. So it's
what's that idea of work that he talks about later, doesn't he?
Yeah. So the only kind of mediator.
I mean, it's interesting because is efficiency in its own way a kind of capitalist or commercial value? So even though that there's a kind of rejection of the commercial, what supposedly saves it is a kind of commercial value, whereas.
Well, because it saves the British part, because it's the British part that's the red. It says like, we know some good work is being done there, which is not the Belgian colonial. When he looks at the map of Africa.
Oh, right,
so
yes.
Again,
the British are better workers. I mean, Yes. Well, a variety of attitudes. It's quite complicated to take into commerce in these novels. I mean, it really depends on the political position of the people involved. So some of the historical novelists, I mean, oddly, almost on the radical side, are kind of pro the commercial, particularly if if it means they can get rid of the uneven playing field of the aristocracy and feudalism. They see commerce as a positive thing. But of course, sort of people who's more interested in terms of the landed aristocracy, or have a Tory bent, if you like, are sort of more suspicious about commerce.
Yes, I was thinking about Helen Maria Williams, who was seen as a radical poet, and she has a poem called An Ode to Peace, where she talks about all the benefits of peace in a kingdom. And she says, the sublime sail of commerce launches once again in a time of peace, whereas in a time of war, you can't have trade. And then in her letters written from France in 1790, she says the sublime, she does say sublime again, the sublime system of republicanism will sail around the world, and everyone will follow France.
Yeah.
So it's commerce and republicanism are
and
together.
They're seen to be linked.
Yes.
I mean, yes, and especially on the radical side, you absolutely do. I was just working on that today. You absolutely do see that connection. So it's almost as if there's the idea. I suppose say somebody. Well, this is my own theory, okay, so not fully worked through, but so somebody like Wollstonecraft, seeing those two, like perhaps commerce and the spread of political knowledge going hand in hand implicitly. But the fear is that somehow feudalism or the remnants of the aristocracy will corrupt that process. So it'll still be the kind of same shows and displays, the same falsity. Everything is done through puppetry and masks, as it always was. So the fear is that kind of mixed mode, that you would have capitalism and a monarchy. That would be like the worst thing. Do you see?
It's very interesting. It troubles me, the conflation of the republicanism and the commerce as this imperialistic spread around the world. Hannah, do you have any more questions?
The historical novel is not something I'm extremely familiar with, but could you say a bit more about the change that Lukács was talking about when he denoted Scott as the first historical novel?
So he says that Waverley in 1814 is the first historical novel, and he says in a way that this results from a greater sense of social transformation. The sense of social transformation emerges out of the events of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. So basically he says that the war in Europe is so widespread, and there's so much kind of mobilization of troops, and people looking on are conscious that they're part of an historic event. So there's this kind of great sense of history, of change, that the people register, that is first shown in Walter Scott's Waverley. So it's that idea of kind of transformation or of history that can be seen and observed that Scott kind of captures, that our own present moment is historical. But, you can see people in the 1790s already responding to that and thinking of the French Revolution almost straight away as an historical event. You see that they're living through themselves. So it's the process is a lot quicker than perhaps Lukács would say. And also because I'm kind of interested in the way I think the key to the historical novel is the way historiography is treated, attitudes towards history in the books themselves. I think you can also posit an earlier historical novel, even before the 1790s. This is where the kind of Walpole and Reeve elements come in, that sometimes are about resisting change, or about fearing change, or breakage, or transformation.
It's more nostalgic in Walpole. Is there a nostalgia going on in these 1790s?
Somebody else asked me this. I find that there is remarkably little nostalgia. In a way, it's just either something that should continue happening, as in like a narrative of ancient liberties, or we should bring it back, or that's the way it is. But it's not. The one who's more elegiac is Jane Porter, but even her vision of history is really underpinned by a kind of almost a kind of cyclical sense, and also because because it's so greatly spiritual. In the case of Jane Porter, that kind of undercuts the idea of nostalgia, because we're kind of spiritually focused, I suppose. So we regret, but we're in. Yeah, we regret, but if we're moving forward, what she says, something like we trade earthly fame for eternal reward. So we might regret that these great aristocratic houses have passed, or these heroes are dead, but then there is the great heavenly reward. So